With me today is Ben Roberts, a preeminent well-being researcher. Ben, can you tell us your current title and institutional affiliation, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm coordinator of the South African Social Attitude Survey at the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa.
Very good. What would you say are your major contributions to the field of well-being?
Well, I think it's pretty much building on the work that Professor Moller has done in South Africa. So it's really continuing the monitoring, continuing the increasing understanding of the nature and changes in well-being in democratic South Africa. I mean, we're obviously a very young democracy, and we're a very youthful democracy. So really we're starting to see signs of very important generational change in the country. And Valerie obviously has a history going back 30 years in this sort of field. But there are very few that have taken up the mantle and are really running with this in a substantive way, doing nationally representative surveys. So I see myself, I've been doing it for the past, in a systematic way, the last 10, 11 years.
Great.
So it's really about continuing the patterns of monitoring, experimenting with more multidimensional measures of well-being and happiness. So really it's about continue year on year tracking the kind of patterns of change that Valerie's been monitoring since the late 70s, and really trying to pose key questions of our society as it begins to mature.
What do you see as important recent changes or trends in this quality of life of South Africans?
I think there's several. Obviously, there's the post '94. There's been a huge emphasis on addressing historical imbalances. The history of apartheid and the systematic oppression of a majority of the population. So there's been a process of normalizing the society, and with that, dealing with the aspirations of people that have been dispossessed, trying to actually bring them back into the main of society. So for us, what's really been key is obviously the standards of living has been changing phenomenally as through state intervention. So fundamentally we've seen key social investment happening, which obviously has a direct effect on patterns of well-being. I think also the key issue that I've mentioned already is the sort of markers of generational change. We're really trying to begin to see, we call them the born frees, people that were either
very poetic,
born after or growing up in democratic South Africa. And really some of the fundamental questions we want to start seeing is, are they going to be fundamentally different? So is there going to be a cohort effect that comes through? Also, did '94 indelibly shape the population as a whole? Are there clear signs that there has been a break with the past and that? But I think on that account, I think what we tend to see is that South Africans are very, in common with much of sub-Saharan Africa, are quite dissatisfied with current life. We're quite optimistic about the future, and that builds into an aspirational culture, and it places a huge expectations on the state to deliver basic provision or provide basic goods and services to the people. So I think there's still a huge progress has been made, but there's still a long way to go. And I think what we want to see is are there signs of new norms coming through, new patterns of well-being that we want to really try and discern as the political landscape changes, as the society begins to change as well.
And you were talking about this, the born frees. Do you see any emerging patterns there that are noteworthy or disparate from the older generation?
I mean, in a broader, also we conduct value surveys in a more general sense. So we've been looking at certain key areas. One is, have they come through as a more tolerant generation? And the signs are encouraging that. I think that they're, in many respects, there are some exceptions. For instance, they're not particularly less xenophobic than older South Africans, so the sense of threat posed by foreigners in the country is strongly ingrained, unfortunately, amongst the youth. But generally speaking, they seem to be a more tolerant generation. One area which is very close to my own heart is looking at basically attitudes towards inequality. South Africa is one of the most unequal, or amongst the top few unequal societies in the world, the highest Gini coefficient. So really understanding attitudes towards and beliefs around inequality, and particularly fundamental is preferences around redress and state redistribution. And there what we were hoping is in line with new sort of norms amongst the youth. We were hoping to see a very strong, something like the American work of Russell Dalton, you know, has a new norm emerged, particularly amongst that youth. You know, new forms of political engagement, etc. And the signs are not very distinct there. We found that certainly on ideology, from an ideological perspective, views in terms of preferences for redress are carrying across generations. So if you're a young black South African, you tend to be more favourable towards redistribution. If you belong to some of the other minority groups that were relatively privileged historically, they have a more critical view, where we would have expected and hoped for a kind of break with the past and a general preference for the societal good. So that's been something that for me is really interesting. And some of the other scholars, for instance, Bob Matters from Afrobarometer has also found similar things. That there's sort of a confounder. We have so many expectations for the youth. They're not entirely able to live up to our own expectations of that of what the new generation we would want them to bring.
Are you measuring prejudice at all? Ethnic prejudice?
Yeah, it's one of the core areas of our work. We have obviously strong intergroup relations component to what we do, whether it's in terms of race relations or in terms of, as I say, things such as xenophobia, homophobia. And we're a society that's still quite conservative. We're extremely religious society. So that to some extent shapes the kind of
what's patterns? Is there a predominant religion, or
the majority are Christian? But as Varia has probably said before, is there's a mix of the traditional African forms of religion wrapped and traditional beliefs that is become over time very integrated with more Western forms of practices around religion. But we're very, it's at least 80% express a strong religious affiliation. So we are deeply a religious society.
In terms of well-being indicators, are there any interesting findings there you can share with us about in some of your studies?
Well, I think one of the things is, if you look at the work that the Valerie's done, coupled with the new data that we're collecting, and it forms a very neat continuation, is we saw, I love the term that Valerie coined. She said 94 was our euphoric moment, and it indeed was a moment. If you look at the history, there was a huge upswing in positive emotion around the transition to democracy. What was really surprising was how short-lived that was. So literally within a year or two, it had fallen dramatically. And since then, what we find is with each successive term of office around key elections, there is slight increase in that sort of sense of increased happiness, increased positive effect, but it's with lower peaks in each successive round. So we've seen, particularly in the last decade of the 2 decades of democracy, we've seen an increasing, more somber mood creeping in amongst the public, and I think that might be partly to do with a creeping realism, the sense that actually these aspirations aren't necessarily going to be fulfilled, concerns about the nature of the direction of our democracy, concerns about corruption, particularly amongst the executive. So I think there's an increasing sense of disquiet amongst the public. We've also seen vigorous, alongside the more subjective measures, quite strong behavioural new patterns emerging, strong social unrest. We've seen in recent years, particularly post-2004, we've seen very vigorous social movements form, strong, often violent public protest, and that's been escalating. I think the last 2 or 3 years we've seen historic levels of that form of political behaviour. So it's again another form of, it's the behavioural outcome of some of these concerns about the slower than anticipated pace of delivery in post 94. So that's really, you know, as for us, that's where, you know, in terms of watching that space, that's really what we're going to be doing.
You know, many well-being researchers such as Ed Diener and people involved with the Gallup World Poll have talked about how the importance of the circumstances and particularly circumstances around democratic government and the rule of law and fairness. Are these some of the concerns people have about the direction of democracy, that it's not as idealistically democratic as it could be, or?
I think it's more about the way institutions are working or not working.
Okay.
So if you look at some of our institutional trust, well, firstly, satisfaction with democracy as a whole has been an extremely volatile measure in South Africa over the last, particularly last 10 to 12 years. We've seen quite strong fluctuations that's followed broad political developments. From the recalling of presidents to you know, concerns about the rise of corruption in the state, and that's also reflected, for instance, in patterns of institutional trust. We've seen again that's been quite a sensitive set of measures that we've included in our surveys, and people have become increasingly harsh towards certain key political institutions in particular. I think well, I think we see it most. We have a decentralised form of government, and we find that the form of government that's closest to the people, our local municipalities, our local government, receives particularly harsh evaluations these days.
Are they the most prone to abuse or corruption in people's perception?
I think, yeah. I mean, one of the things we've had is in the awarding of public tenders, for instance. There's been a lot of irregularities there. And so,
what do you mean by that?
There's seen as a lot of collusion in decision making around the awarding. So,
and what are these awards?
Well, it's for big development contracts in local municipalities. So it's about big housing developments or the delivery of basic goods and services and
government programs.
And what's happening is often it's seen to be, you know, either key political figures have business interests on the side and channel funds through their own organisations or through friends and, you know, nepotistic relations. So there have been some very high-profile cases, not only at a local level, also nationally. But I think at a national level, there's sort of there's an issue of proximity, and I think the issues of historic loyalties, sympathies. So to some degree, national government gets away with and with it, and I think that local government gets particularly harsh critiques from the public, and that's been very clear across the decade. So I think also what's very clear, and going back to these general satisfaction with democracy measures, we're finding there were two key moments in the last 5 years. 2008 was the year which our president was removed from office, and actually that happened to be a year where we had widespread xenophobic violence. So it was a particularly tough year for the country, and it was the first year in democratic South Africa we had more people discontent with democracy than satisfied. There's been some with President Zuma coming in 2009, following the 2009 national elections. There was he came in on very much a populist agenda, and people actually bought into it and felt, well, this is a positive turn. So we saw the levels of satisfaction with democracy rise again.
The brief euphoria you spoke of?
And it was brief again. So we've seen it since 2010. It's quickly reversed because people sort of began to increasingly see this isn't going to bring about a fundamental change, and certainly not quickly. So again, by 2012, 2013, you know, we've seen again, going back to almost 2008 levels, greater level of public discontent with democracy relative to the share that are actually contented. So it is these, you know, I think of all the measures we have in our survey, from basic quality of life indicators through to these kind of big macro political variables. I think we've seen that's the area where we've seen the greatest volatility. South Africans are quite, although they may deny it, they're quite keen followers of political developments, and their judgments follow suit, and
so they're very involved in their democracy. They care very much.
I mean, you ask them how interested are you in politics, and they probably say not very much. But the reality is,
their
behaviour, they generally are, and the behaviour expresses it,
and they think about it a lot.
And they think about it a lot, and because of that, a lot of our core political indicators are wonderful barometers of our society. Yeah.
So, any more practical implications of some of this survey research you've been doing in the area of well-being and other indicators?
I think for us, certainly, and it's becoming an increasing concern, is how to reach the policymaker. I mean, obviously, I think as someone that is a coordinator of a major survey series, trying to bridge that divide between academia and distilling that into simple, non-technical messages that policymakers can draw on is something that we've been trying to grapple with in the last decade. I think we have a huge responsibility that going out, doing these interviews every year, burdening respondents, it is fundamental that we actually communicate some of those desires, some of those concerns to the decision maker. And so
are there any government-funded surveys you're involved with, or is all this privately funded?
Increasingly, and this is what's been exciting me, is there's been a change in government culture in the increasingly I've seen it mostly in the last 5 years again, and there's a strong interest in monitoring and evaluation, in evidence-based policy making.
Very good.
And so,
do they also buy into well-being measures per se, or subjective measures, or is there still work to be done there?
No, I think the state has bought into that. I think.
Did you help to advocate for that?
I think to some degree, just the regular publication of non-technical summaries as I like to think, maybe it's my it's difficult to say, but I think it has made a modest contribution.
And I
think it's part of a bigger global phenomenon. I think if we look at the various nations around the world are increasingly recognizing the limits to focusing on a monetary approach to defining what the good life is for any society.
But you've made an effort to put your findings in non-technical forms of media and share them?
Yes. Fortunately, my organisation has a quarterly magazine, news magazine, where in 2008 we made a very conscious decision to ensure regular content from our surveys on a range of themes, just to increasingly just educate the public about some key issues. And it's written in a very simple way. There's no strong jargon or theoretical concepts that we feature in there. It's written in a simple narrative. It has 2 or 3 key figures, usually cross tabulations or simple graphs.
Has any of this been picked up by the mainstream media?
It gets very widespread coverage, and I think that's
that's very good.
It's very positive. So the media loves it because it's short, it's to the point, it's easily interpretable.
Well, I would put that with one of your great contributions, because it's a theme of well-being researchers that are trying to get the ear of policymakers. It really seems to take a concerted effort, and what I'm surprised is that you haven't had to do the legwork of individual communication with policymakers and politicians. That's often the model.
No, we have had to do
in places like Mexico, or you have done some of that.
We have obviously made strong direct efforts to engage as well.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But the one thing that I've noticed in the last 3 years is it's gone from a situation where we're constantly knocking on doors to where now the policymakers are knocking on ours.
Well, that's a wonderful experience.
Increasingly, it has been. And
it's like Ed Diener, where he was denied promotion, and then years later, the Center for Disease Control.
I think partly it's because of this global movement towards building, worrying about well-being and quality
on a national level, national indicators.
And so what we find is we'll get, for instance, government departments coming. For instance, recently we've had the Department of Education worrying in a high inflation environment, worrying about energy-related perceptions and behaviour. So in a no one else is really doing that in the country, but they actually are now saying, look, we need to monitor this. And we include in our survey a kind of module for them. We publish a report which is actually adopted by that department. It ends up with a minister writing a foreword.
Very good.
And it's adopted by them. So
Very good. Good
and I think that's the kind of thing which we want to see more and more. That actually the state departments really want to know what the people think about these key issues, really want to tap into the public sentiment about not only what they think about key issues and key policy choices which might be on the horizon, but also wanting to understand what are the behavioural implications of key developments. And that as a social scientist, as a quality of life scholar, is very rewarding.
Very exciting. Now, you said too you were proud of some contributions you've made in terms of metrics and multidimensional measures. Can you tell us about any innovations there that you feel good about in terms of particularly the well-being aspect of your measurements?
Yeah, I think we tend to think of ourselves often that we lag behind the European and American norms, but I think one of the things that I'm certainly very proud of, and I know Valerie Moller is also very proud of it, is a study which we've undertaken in the last 18 months to 2 years, where it's a collaborative study between Algeria and South Africa, so it's almost like looking at quality of life on the tips of a continent.
Yes, very interesting.
And what we've actually done, we've included a whole range of measures in a single instrument, but the thing I'm most excited about is I think it's the first time where the 1965 Cantrell measures have been replicated wholesale. So it's not just the ladder part of the scale. It includes the qualitative anchors as well. So
there's a lot of wonderful, rich stuff there.
And we've even so we're currently in the middle of analysing that data.
Exciting.
We've used the original Cantrell coding system with a little bit of adaptation. Obviously, some of the things have changed over time in terms of the fall of communism, which was kind of a key threat when Cantrell did his original study.
Well, that's very exciting. Can you give us any snippets of results, or is it too early?
No, it's not too early.
Okay.
I think in terms of the more textured results, we're finding, again, obviously for both in Algeria and South Africa, which are low to middle income countries, we're finding material concerns predominate. We've got high unemployment in both societies, high levels of deprivation. So we find that comes through both in terms of the personal hopes as well as the personal concerns about the direction societies are taking. I think what fascinates me is, and it's something that's very rooted in historically in African notions of well-being, is the emphasis on family. And I think it's not only Africa, increasingly, this has been a very important conference that we've had here with Halloran, because I think we're seeing it in certain presentations that have come from India, China,
Latin America.
That a recurrent theme is this focus issue about the family. And for us, that really is quite stark in this data that's coming out. So it's right up there with the kind of personal economic hopes and concerns. Worries about obviously hopes for your children and the next generation, but also that brings with it fears as well. Are they going to succeed, particularly in countries? Algeria's just come out of obviously a very dark period in its history, so is South Africa. So we are worried about what's the generational dividend. And I think...
And there's economic challenges in both countries.
Yeah, I mean, we have extremely high youth unemployment rates. And that's been, in the case of Algeria, it's linked to instability in the whole Middle East and North Africa region of the Arab Spring, which came out in South Africa. Some of our key scholars in South Africa have been increasingly talking about we need to be wary about potential for an African Spring. And we certainly, there's a lot of discontent amongst the youth because they had aspirations of getting a job, having social mobility relative to their parents, getting a better education, and really making that transition to adulthood and flourishing.
Yes, and some material accoutrements, like a car
and that is
or a
happening,
house.
but it's probably not happening. It's happening particularly for I think for a more sort of middle class, particularly amongst middle class black house families, that's definitely happening, and you're seeing it in a fundamental way. But for the majority, a lot of them have not benefited. They've managed to have better educational access. They've not necessarily had better educational quality. And also what's happening is, so you're getting greater pressures at the entry level in the labour market for unskilled labour. So it's creating huge difficulties there, and that's translating into extremely high youth unemployment rates. So that's an area which we're watching very closely, and the state is really starting to engage in creative ideas about trying to find creative ways to insert the youth into jobs through, obviously through vocational training, through areas such as one of the key areas is a youth wage subsidy. It's about placing them, actually creating, incentivizing for the private sector to take on youngsters, to give them their first experiences at a subsidised rate. So there are a lot of, and obviously some of these are quite contested policy options, but it's really fundamental for the society to progress. So I think these are really exciting. But so certainly in the African context, I think the generational patterns of difference, because we tend to be youthful societies relative to other more developed country contexts where it's an aging society. We're very youthful ones, so we hear a lot about demographic dividends, but we need to be very careful that opportunities that it represents are not squandered, are not, and that it doesn't actually translate over time into something of a demographic curse for these societies. So again, it's an area which, as a social scholar, we really, and a quality of life scholar, we need to monitor very closely.
Well, and that's something I applaud you for, is this holding a mirror up, if you will, to the culture. And I do see a real partnership with the government and the citizenry that remains, at least ultimately, very optimistic. So I applaud your work, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure.
Wow.